The legislative branch writes broad statutes, but those statutes are not self-executing. It is up to executive administrative agencies to draft the granular, enforceable rules that actually govern daily life. Once those rules are finalized, they are bound in the Pennsylvania Code, a static, permanent volume where state regulations reside. Before a rule ever reaches that permanent code, it has to survive the Pennsylvania Bulletin. This publication serves as the real-time, chronological circulatory system of agency rulemaking. By deconstructing a single issue of this gazette, we can observe the exact mechanical operation of the state as it navigates data gaps and public friction. Abstract state power only becomes actionable, enforceable compliance through this highly specific weekly publishing mechanism. Our primary artifact is Volume 35, Number 37 of the Bulletin, published on September 10, 2005. Inside, the list of Pennsylvania Code chapters affected functions as the literal ledger tracking every proposed and finalized change to state law. For our case studies, we are isolating two specific nodes in this ledger: Title 25, covering environmental protection, and Title 58, covering recreation. Every rule must survive a rigid procedural gauntlet: initial drafting as a proposed rulemaking, a mandatory period of public comment, and eventually, final adoption. Notices contained in this single issue represent regulations caught at radically different stages of this life cycle. A government gazette's table of contents is a snapshot of varying regulatory velocities and administrative friction. Our primary case study begins on page 5005, detailing a regulatory action by the Delaware River Basin Commission. The Commission's specific legal objective is to classify the lower Delaware River as significant resource waters. This proposed environmental protection zone has precise geographical boundaries, stretching from River Mile 209.5 at the Delaware Water Gap down to River Mile 133.4, the head of tide at Trenton. The legal justification for this mandate is rooted in the high scenic, recreational, and ecological values of this specific stretch of water. This significant resource waters designation places a heavy burden on state agencies to enforce strict anti-degradation standards. A legal mandate to protect a vulnerable resource is completely unenforceable without a quantifiable baseline to measure that degradation against. The core regulatory barrier the Commission faced was that permanent classification requires exact numeric values defining the existing water quality. Establishing those numeric values requires compiling a rigorous 5-year dataset, spanning from the year 2000 through 2004. The crucial final year of data from 2004 had only just become available for analysis at the time of this publication. The months required to process this data leave the river unprotected from degradation in the interim. This illustrates a consistent paradox in environmental rulemaking. The speed of ecological risk moves much faster than scientific validation. An agency cannot legally enforce a strict numeric standard based on incomplete science, creating a massive administrative bottleneck. To navigate this bottleneck, the Delaware River Basin Commission utilized a precise administrative workaround, Resolution 2005-2. They passed a temporary amendment. This mechanism confers immediate baseline protections to the river while actively suspending the strict enforcement clauses that require numeric data. As printed in the bulletin, this temporary rule was given a highly specific short-term expiration date of September 30, 2005. To make the rule legally sound, the Commission had to carve out explicit regulatory exemptions in Section 3.10.3 A2G6. One of those exemptions was the specific suspension of the point source requirement concerning how pollution is dispersed to ensure no measurable change at control points. You cannot legally enforce a rule demanding no measurable change if you do not have the measured numeric baseline to prove it. The temporary rule is an intentionally incomplete measure, holding the line until the scientific processing catches up and allows for permanent codification. Temporary rulemaking is the exact legal instrument used to decouple immediate preventative protection from longitudinal scientific proof. We can observe a completely different regulatory velocity by pivoting to our secondary case study in this exact same issue, a Fish and Boat Commission rule governing fishing tournaments. This specific amendment eliminated a requirement that tournament anglers establish a daily culling limit of 1 fish less than the statewide creel limit. During the mandatory public comment period for this proposed rule, the Commission received 0 public comments. This chart shows the direct contrast with the Delaware River Basin Commission rule, which generated approximately 1,450 public comments and forced actual modifications to their proposal. This is the principle of stakeholder friction. The speed at which a rule moves from the bulletin into permanent law scales inversely with the volume of public and industrial impact. Pulling back from these specific texts, we can observe the macro structure of administrative law in motion. First, an agency mandate dictates the creation of a proposed rule, which is then formally published in the bulletin. Next comes the friction phase, where the proposed rule hits the realities of scientific data gaps and intense public comment periods. Finally, the resolution phase forces agencies to utilize temporary bridging mechanisms and rule modifications to successfully finalize the law for the permanent code. These mechanisms prove the administrative state is not a rigid monolith, but an active, highly responsive, iterative engine. The physical artifact of the Pennsylvania Bulletin anchors this entire governmental process. It functions as the transparent, legally mandated mechanism allowing for the continuous refinement of state law. A printed government gazette appears mundane, yet it contains the precise mechanical steps required to shape environmental survival and public policy. To truly understand how law governs reality, one must understand the chronological mechanics of how it is built, tested, and temporarily bridged. The permanence and authority of the code relies entirely on the temporary, pragmatic friction recorded every single week in the bulletin.